The night before my wedding, my grandmother came and sat at the foot of my bed. I was 17 years old, lying under the heavy wool blanket she had woven herself on the old loom in the back room, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling, listening to the sound of wind moving through the wheat fields that stretched out beyond the kitchen window. I thought, finally, someone is going to sit down and tell me something real. Finally, someone who has lived this life and knows what I do not know is going to lean close and give me a map for the country I was about to enter. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked down at them for a long moment, and then she said, "Sleep well, Naomi. Tomorrow will be a full day." That was all. That was the sum of everything I was given on the eve of a night that would change the shape of my life. If you have ever lain awake before something enormous, knowing it was rushing toward you and knowing almost nothing else about it, then stay with me. Because what I'm about to tell you about the night a boy I had known for less than 7 months came quietly into my bedroom with my parents' full knowledge and blessing is going to be different from what you are expecting. And the part that surprised me most was not what happened. It was how almost cheerfully everyone around me insisted it was simply the way things were done. If you want to go deeper into what life inside a closed community like mine was really like, I go further in the description. And if you want to keep hearing the stories we were raised never to speak out loud, subscribe, leave a like, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. I grew up in a conservative Hutterite colony in southern Alberta, a flat and windswept stretch of land where the sky was so large it felt like a weight pressing down on your shoulders on certain days. We were not Amish. People sometimes confuse the two, but the resemblance was close enough in the ways that mattered most. The plain dress, the communal life, the wall between our world and the one outside it, and the silence, especially the silence around certain things. Education ended in a formal sense around the age of 15, after which your learning was the kitchen, the colony laundry, the nursery where the small children needed constant tending, the long tables in the communal dining hall that had to be set and cleared 3 times a day for more than 80 people. By 16, you were expected to begin thinking seriously about your future. By 17, if a young man from a neighboring colony had expressed interest through the right channels, through your father, through the colony preacher, through the quiet nods of people who had opinions about these things, it was considered a serious matter. By the time I was 17 and a half, I was engaged to a boy named Jacob who came from a colony 2 hours north of ours, near a town called Coaldale. The courtship had followed its expected path. He came to visit twice a month on Saturdays. He sat with my father and the other men. He ate at our table. He was quiet and competent and came from a family with a strong work record and a good reputation, and those were the things that mattered most. And then there was the bedside visiting. I do not know what to call it in one clean phrase because we did not have a single name for it the way the Amish have the word bundling. What I can tell you is that it was understood, permitted, and practiced, that a courting young man, after the colony had grown quiet and the lights in the main hall had gone out, would come to the door of the girl's family quarters and be admitted, and that he would sit beside her in the dark or by the low light of a single lamp, and they would talk. That was the form of it. That was the shape that courtship took in the private hours, supervised by the walls around you, your mother in the next room, your younger sisters breathing quietly beyond the thin partition, your father's presence as near and solid as the floorboards themselves. The first time Jacob came this way, I was 16. My cousin Marlene had passed along word that he intended to ask. I said yes, because that was the answer a girl gave when the young man's family was respectable, and your own parents looked at each other in the particular way that meant the matter was already settled in the eyes of everyone who counted. I lay in my bed that first night in my plain dress, the lamp turned to its lowest and wavering. My heart was moving so quickly I could feel it in the back of my throat. The colony was still. The only sounds were the wind against the single window and the distant sound of the grain equipment someone had left running in the equipment barn. He knocked. That small thing. He knocked, quietly, twice before he opened the door. I have thought about that knock many times in the years since, about what it meant that he did it, about whether he understood that it meant something, or whether it was simply a habit learned from watching his own father. He stood in the doorway for a moment, a shape against the darker shape of the hallway. Then he came in and sat on the wooden chair beside the bed, not on the bed itself, not that first night. And after a silence that felt much longer than it was, he said, "Your father says the winter wheat came in well this year." I said, "It did, better than last year." And that was how it started. We talked for nearly 2 hours that first night, about the colony, about whether his younger brother was going to be assigned to the mechanic shop or the hog barn, about a dispute between 2 families on his colony that everyone had opinions about. Somewhere past midnight his hand moved, slowly to rest on the edge of the blanket near my arm. I felt my entire body go careful and still. The warmth of the gesture was not something I had a category for. Outside, in the equipment barn, something shifted and settled. I fell asleep before he left. I woke to the gray early light and the smell of breakfast being started in the communal kitchen, and the world looked exactly as it had the night before. And I did not yet understand that something had already begun inside me that I had no language for and no preparation to navigate. He came again the following Saturday, and the one after that. What happened between us over those months followed the expected shape of things, slow, careful, the weight of the colony's expectations pressing on both of us like a hand between our shoulder blades, a conversation that went somewhere real, somewhere we did not go in front of others. The first time he kissed me, briefly, seriously, as if he had made a quiet decision, was sometime in the 3rd month. I had never been kissed before. I was not prepared for what my body did in response to it. The warmth that moved outward through my chest, the wanting that I had no name for and had been given no vocabulary to examine. Nobody had told me that wanting was a thing that would arrive whether or not you invited it. Nobody had said that your body was going to have its own clear opinions regardless of what your mind had been instructed to believe. And here is what I have only found words for much later, sitting in a small office in Calgary across from a therapist who had a row of plants on her windowsill and a patience I had not known was possible. The practice of bedside visiting, of courtship conducted in the private dark, puts 2 young people in an intimate space and trusts willpower to serve as the only partition. It assumes that you can feel everything you are feeling, the warmth of another person, the closeness, the specific gravity of their presence in the dark, and simply choose, through will and faith, not to cross the line. Sometimes you can. Often you can. But sometimes the line is harder to find than anyone told you it would be, and nobody had told you where to look. If this is resonating with you, if you are finding something in this story that feels close to an experience of your own or someone you love, I hope you will share it, subscribe, and keep listening. There is still so much more I have not gotten to yet. A girl I grew up with, I will call her Ruth because that is not her name, married the autumn before I did at 18. One evening in the late winter, at a sewing gathering in one of the family quarters, after the older women had said their good nights and gone home, she said something quietly while her hands kept moving over the fabric on her lap. She said, "Did anyone explain to you what you were supposed to feel when he came to sit with you at night?" The room went very still, the kind of still that means every person present is listening and no one is going to acknowledge that they are. Someone said after a moment, "No, just no." Ruth nodded and turned back to her sewing. That was all. But I understood the full geography of what she was asking. She was asking whether any of us had been given a map for the territory our bodies had already entered without our permission. She was asking whether the confusion, the guilt, the strange grief of not understanding your own experience from the inside, whether that belonged to her alone or to all of us together. It was all of us. The colony's rules, the dense unspoken code that governed every detail of how we dressed and ate and worshipped and worked, was precise about an enormous range of things. What colors a woman could wear, which tasks belonged to which families in rotation, whether a certain kind of machinery was appropriate for colony use or represented too much concession to the outside world. But about the inner life of a 17-year-old girl lying in the near dark beside a young man she was learning to love? About that, the code said nothing. That silence was not accidental. It was a kind of theology. The body existed in the context of marriage. Marriage existed in the context of family. Family existed in the context of the colony and God's design for it. And the way all of that actually felt, from the inside, from the body's own perspective, was not a subject the community had developed a language for. So we made do with what we had, with restraint as the only instruction, with the hope that wanting less was the same as being good. Ruth told me years later, when we were both living in Calgary in apartments 2 streets apart and sometimes met for coffee, that she had spent the first year of her marriage convinced that something had gone wrong with her faith. She had felt things during those evening visits that she had not been taught to account for. She had interpreted that as a failure of her relationship with God. She had prayed about it seriously at length for months before she arrived at the understanding that she had simply not been given enough information to know the difference between a spiritual failing and a human feeling. That is the cost of that particular silence. Not only the not knowing, but the shame that grows dense and heavy in the space where knowledge should have been. I married Jacob in the last week of September. The ceremony was a full colony event. More than 200 people. Hours of worship and singing, the communal meal prepared by the women's kitchen crew over 2 days, roast duck and potato dumplings, and a sweet cream cake that had been Jacob's grandmother's recipe. My cheeks ached from smiling by the time the evening had wound down, and the dining hall had been cleared, and the older people had retired, and the noise had gradually emptied itself out of the building until only a few voices remained somewhere distant. And the night was quiet, and the two of us were alone in the small quarters that had been prepared for us. I had been awake since 4 a.m. I was more unprepared than I had been on the very first night Jacob had come quietly to my door, because all those evenings of sitting together in the dark, careful, intense, and full of things neither of us could say out loud, had not told me what marriage would be. They had taught me the particular rhythm of his breathing when he was close to sleep. They had taught me the way his voice changed when he was saying something true instead of something dutiful. They had not taught me anything about my own body that I had not already been instructed to regard with suspicion. The room was plain and small, a wooden bed Jacob and his brother had built and brought south the week before, a quilt stitched by the women of his home colony in blue and cream, a basin of water on the stand, no mirror. The lamp on the table between us burned low. I could hear voices still moving somewhere in the building, a door, footsteps, the distant sound of someone's child. Privacy inside a colony is a negotiated thing, more intention than architecture. Jacob sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at his hands. I stood near the window. "I don't think I know what I'm doing," he said. I thought, I don't either. I did not say it. I had not yet learned that honesty between two people who are trying to love each other is not the same thing as indecency. What followed was not the transformation I had been led to expect, in the wordless way a community imparts expectations without ever naming them directly. It was not a threshold crossing into a new and luminous version of womanhood. It was two young people, exhausted and uncertain, and genuinely kind to each other, reaching carefully towards something that neither of us had been given the preparation or the language to understand. There was discomfort. There were moments where I wanted to ask questions and did not know how to begin them. There was also, and I want to be honest about this because the whole of a thing matters more than only the parts that are easy to say, a tenderness I had not expected. He was careful. He stopped when I went still. He asked quietly more than once if I was all right. We were not failed by each other. We were failed by the silence that had surrounded both of us for our entire lives. After the room was very quiet, I lay looking at the ceiling and listening to the wheat fields somewhere beyond the building and felt not transformed, not broken, but aware. Aware in a way that was permanent and sharp. Aware that I had stepped into a life whose shape had been decided for me long before I had finished becoming myself. He pulled me close against his side and said, "We will work this out together." I believed him. I wanted to. I tried to for a long time. I was 23 when I left the colony. The shunning was total and swift, the way only something built entirely from love and conviction can be. Letters came back unopened. Phone calls were not answered or were answered and then ended quickly. The one time I reached my mother, her voice was careful and remote, as if she were speaking from behind a glass wall to someone she was not permitted to fully acknowledge. I grieve the colony the way you grieve a country you have been exiled from, with a homesickness that has no physical address to point itself toward. In therapy, in that small office with the plants on the sill, I encountered words I had never been given: autonomy, bodily knowledge, informed consent. I learned that understanding your own body is not arrogance or vanity or sinfulness. It is the most basic form of self-respect a person can extend toward themselves. I learned that a 17-year-old girl who has been told explicitly and through every surrounding silence that her body exists for God and her husband and the continuation of the community and for nothing else has not been protected. She has been kept deliberately uninformed. And those are not the same thing. The consequences are not the same thing. I do not look back at Jakob on the edge of that bed with anger. He was as lost as I was, operating with the same incomplete map. I do not look back at the practice of bedside visiting itself as something evil or predatory in its intent. I look back at it as a system that placed teenagers in the most intimate and confusing territory of human experience, with no information and no preparation, and called the resulting restraint a form of virtue. I look back at my grandmother on the foot of my bed the night before my wedding, looking down at her folded hands, saying nothing, and I understand now that she was also a woman who had been given nothing. She gave me what she had been given. The silence was not hers alone to break. The silence was older than both of us. But here is what I know now that I did not know at 17, lying in the dark, listening for the sound of careful footsteps in the hall, heart loud in my chest, no map, no words, no one willing to say out loud what was already happening inside me. You were not wrong for feeling what you felt. You were not failing spiritually when your body responded to warmth and closeness and the specific gravity of another person present in the dark. You were not sinful for wanting things you could not name, things no one had given you names for. You were human. And being human is not something you should have had to apologize for, then or ever. I was not too young to learn the colony's full code of conduct by heart. I was not too young to run a household and 10 small children and work a full kitchen shift and sit through 4 hours of worship without complaint. I was too young only in this one specific sense. I had not yet been given enough information about my own self to understand that I had a right to know myself before I promised myself to anyone else. That knowledge did not belong to God to withhold and dole out through the machinery of marriage. It belonged to me. It had always belonged to me. I simply did not know that yet. If any part of what I have said today has landed somewhere real for you, I hope you will stay with me. Subscribe, share this with someone who might need to hear it, and turn on the notification bell, because everything I have told you today is only the surface of what is still waiting to be said. I will see you in the next one. Wherever you come from, whatever you were handed in place of information, you are allowed to know yourself. That is not a small thing. It might be the whole thing.